Hi, this is Andy Neill, the author of Ready, Steady, Go, The Weekend Starts Here. You're listening to Waterloo Underground with Miriam and Johnny.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1. It was the Manfreds.
Hey there, Waterloo Undergrounders. You're listening to a brand new episode of Waterloo Underground with your hosts,
Johnny
and Miriam. And today we've got a very special guest from across the pond. Andy Neill is here. We're going to be discussing his brand new, massive, gigantic, gorgeous, fantabulous, essential, amazing, astonishing, superphonic book, Ready, Steady, Go. The weekend starts here. And our weekend starts right now with this conversation with Andy. Say hey, Andy.
Hey, Andy. Hi, Miriam. Hi, Johnny.
Hey. So, look, we got this book arriving, through the USPS, and everybody was complaining, from the mailman to the person who brought it to the door, about this heavy duty book. It's so massive and so incredible, eye-popping. Tell us a little bit about how this all started, how the book started, and then we're going to go back and talk to you about your early days as a wee tyke and how you became obsessed with this fantastic program that really brought all the music together back then and now.
The idea started, I'd done a book on The Who. I'd co-written a book on The Who, a similar sort of heavy hernia-inducing book on The Who. And two of the people I'd interviewed for it were Vicky Wickham and Michael Lindsay Hogg. And Vicky was the producer on Ready, Steady, Go, and Michael was the director on what I would call the glory years of the show, the most important years, and when the show was quite innovative, and The Who were quite a regular feature. So I was curious to know about, any stories about that. And when that book came out, I was sort of thinking, well, what's an idea for a follow-up? And then it dawned on me, I've always been fascinated by this show, and it's never really been documented properly. I mean, there's been tons of books, if you're talking about British pop shows, on like Top of the Pops, which is sort of like, I guess, like American Bandstand over there. It just ran for years and years every week, and it ran to a very specific format, whereas Ready, Steady, Go sort of was right at the moment, when there was that fantastic, started with the British invasion, 63, 64, and then went through that sort of mod pop thing, Carnaby Street, just at the dawn of sort of psychedelia in 66, and all the fashions and everything that went with it. And I thought, it's never really been done. And so this was back, would you believe, in 2003, I had the idea for it. And I got in touch with Vicky. I met her in New York, funnily enough, because she lives in New York. And I said, let's, how about we do this book? You've been talking about it and it hasn't been done. And we thought, right, let's do it. And 17 years on, nearly 20 years on, we finally got it done. So quite a lot of Ready, Steady, Stop on the way.
Really, a whole lot. Well, how did you get started in your interest in the whole British invasion? You're a little bit younger, and you probably got into it when the next wave was coming along.
That's right.
What happened?
Yeah.
Were your parents musical? Did you have older brothers and sisters, cousins?
Yeah, yes to all the above. My father was really into music, and my uncle, and that was sort of passed on to my 3 elder siblings. I've got 2 elder brothers and a sister. And my oldest brother was the perfect age for Ready, Steady, Go. I mean, we were living, funny enough, over in New Zealand. I'm from New Zealand originally. And we were just like, there was a lot of music around the house. My brother, bought the records all the time, had the, Fabulous magazine, Rave, all those magazines. And so it was pretty firmly entrenched in him. And, he was so into it that I sort of got into it by osmosis, if you like. It was passed on. So, by the time he moved on, he went to college in 1970, he left all his records behind. And I sort of inherited them by default because I couldn't afford to buy records myself at that time. I sort of had this Aladdin's cave of music there that he'd left behind, and it was all the usual suspects: Beatles, Stones, Yardbirds, Kinks, Pretty Things, you name it.
Easy Beats?
And so again, Easy Beats, yes, of course.
Okay.
So that I think, you know, I was sort of interested to a degree in what was happening in, you know, the early 70s and all that, you know, Bowie, Slade, T-Rex and what have you, but it was really the 60s stuff. Not just the music, but the look as well. You know, I'd look through old, you know, secondhand copies of Fabulous and even old NMEs and Melody Makers, and you'd see a picture of the Kinks. And, you know, they had a style. There was a style there that the bands from the sort of like, you know, the 70s, certain ones had it, but a lot of them didn't. It, like that style aspect had gone out the window in a way. And so it stuck with me. And it was very, very unfashionable in the 70s to sort of like, because everybody was still looking forward in a way, to say that like my favorite bands, you know, sort of like, you know, the Stones, yeah, but you must like the Stones with Ronnie Wood. No, I like the Stones with Brian Jones. It was a weird sort of like, you almost considered a throwback, but it stuck with me, and I was always fascinated by it. And there wasn't really that much to know, so I was always, even then, trying to dig out what I could find about that era, including Ready Steady Go. You know, I'd see pictures of the bands on the show that were taken every week, and I'd say, hang on a minute, that backdrop looks familiar, or that, you know, and then it sort of, the penny dropped that it was this show that happened every week that had all these great bands and artists on it.
Can you give us a background on Ready Steady Go itself for posterity? There may be some listeners out there who know about it, but they don't know when it started or exactly what it was all about. Can you let us know about that?
Sure. Well, it started in the middle of 1963, and it's a bit difficult. I'll try and give you a sort of a quick summary, because it's a bit like American television, where you've got different networks all across the country. In England in those days, it was the BBC was the government station, and then commercial television, independent television as it's called here, had all these little different networks that covered all different parts of the British Isles. So the London station was a company called Associated Rediffusion, and that was the company that basically you know, started Ready Steady Go. The guy who ran the show was a guy called Alkin Allen. He's kind of an eccentric maverick in a way, and he was quite anti-showbiz. And when I say anti-showbiz, he didn't like the glitz and the sort of obvious presentation. He wanted it to be a bit more gritty, and you know, he wanted it to be like it was, you know, in a sort of a seedy review, not sort of something with lots of tinsel and glamour. And so he had the idea to have the show running from the basement studio of where the company was running from. And it was only like a little 40-foot by 60-foot basement. You know, in fact, it's a car park now. You know, that's what it was. It was just this concrete basement studio. And it started off sort of like a magazine type show. I don't know if you have magazine, but it's basically like a, you know, what's happening this weekend, as well as a band. You'd have, oh, this play is opening and this book is just out and this film is opening in the West End, you know. And so it was running like that. And Keith Fordyce, who sort of was the main anchorman, who in 1963, I think he was about 34 years old. Now that was ancient, you know, but he was sort of a safe pair of hands. He was very professional, and he could keep the show, because it was a live show. He could be trusted to keep the train on the track and keep it running properly. But it was pretty obvious quickly that they needed, because they were trying to appeal to young people, and the pop element was taking over, especially when the Beatles were coming through and everything, that they needed like a young sort of somebody that personified the teenager, you know. So he put an advertisement in the Melody Maker and a few other like industry type newspapers and magazines, and like hundreds of kids, as you can imagine, answered the ad thinking they had what it took. And one of them was this girl from South London, who was this sort of like typical teenager, very shy, very gauche, called Kathy McGowan. And even though she had no previous experience and was very nervous on camera, she had that, you know, that X factor that they needed, that sort of identified her with the kids that were watching it, because they could see that she was inexperienced, and it could be them up there doing what she was doing. And that sort of, as soon as she became part of the show, the ratings just rocketed, because suddenly it went from being a show that was, I wouldn't say patronizing, but that was almost sort of like, you know, looking at pop music and teen trends from an older perspective, to somebody like a kid who was going to the dance halls, going to Carnaby Street to pick up the clothes, you know, was tongue-tied when she interviewed Paul McCartney or Mick Jagger, you know. So everyone, it was a factor that everyone could sort of pick up on, and it really was the key to the success of the show.
But as far as the production of the show, Elk and Allen trusted a bunch of really young, almost inexperienced kids to run the show.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, right from the get-go, I mean, because of his sort of, he was quite a left-leaning journalist, and he'd worked in current affairs, and he didn't really know anything about music, but it was almost like a social experiment for him to put people into these positions and see what would eventuate, rather than having sort of like what I would call industry professionals sort of pretending to be hip or pretending that, you know, they know what they're on about when, you know, they never went to a dance hall, they didn't know who the bands were or what have you. And that continued all the way through. You know, when these sort of key people that were connected with the show came in, you'll find that basically they didn't have a great track record in this sort of work before, but it was this sort of magical element that it all coalesced and it all worked, because their inexperience seemed to, you know, drive the show on, and seemed to just, you know, every new step it took, the new people would come in and it would evolve.
So once Kathy was in and things were beginning to really happen, was the reception throughout the country completely over the top? What did they get negativity from the adult factor or from grown-ups?
Oh yeah, sure. I mean, because in those days, because I mean, you guys were spoiled where you had all these television channels. In Britain, there was only two TV channels in '63 when it started, and even by the time Ready Steady Go finished in '66, there was only 3. They added one more television channel, so you were really limited by, you know, what you could see. So, you know, and Ready Steady Go went out in what we call the tea time hour. I don't know what you'd call it there, but it was like 6 o'clock viewing. So in those days, everybody used to like be in front of the television. It was sort of like the focal point of entertainment in the house, and so people would be having their dinner, you know, like watching the television. And in those days, if you could get viewers in, if you could get ratings in at like 6 o'clock, it was really important at that time slot, because people tended not to switch channels. They would stay on that one channel throughout the evening. So you'd find invariably that like the parents would be sitting with the kids, you know, indulging them, you know, okay, you want to watch Ready Steady Go, okay, I'll sit and watch it with you while I'm doing my crossword or having my dinner. And, you know, they would see bands like the Pretty Things on there, and, you know, angry of like Surbiton writes, you know, I let my children watch Ready Steady Go as long as there's an artist like Cliff Richard on, but, you know, this is taking it too far. These guys look like girls, you know, and the dancers, they don't dance together. Guys dance together and all this stuff. You know, it was quite avant-garde in some way, you know. So there was a reaction to it, you're right. But I think after a while, you know, I think that's why they kept Keith Fordyce in the show for so long, because he was sort of seen like your avuncular uncle, who was sort of like the guy making sure the kids don't run wild at the party. You see what I mean? Whereas Kathy,
yeah,
the kids that knew they were switched on.
Well, in 3 years, you know, what an impact that it had to survive for generations and generations as this legendary program, where the music still is as lively and as important now, maybe even more so than it was at the time when it was really being created. 3 short years, right?
Yeah, three and a half years to be exact. And but when you look at those 3.5 years, as we do now with the benefit of hindsight, you know, they're probably arguably 3.5 years of the greatest music ever created in that period, not just in Britain, but America as well, you know, and around the world. And you know, they weren't to know that they were sort of like surfing the wave, if you like, of all this change in music and fashion and what have you. And it sort of, as I speak to all these, when I interviewed like people like Vicky and Michael, I said, you know, I know it's pretentious to say, like, were you aware you were like creating art or anything like that, but were you aware that you were living through special times? And they didn't know. You know, it was just another week, another show, you know, and all their friends, you know, like, you know, all these bands were their friends. So Andrew Oldham would ring up Vicky and say, you know, not just the Stones, but all the, you know, people on, you know, like the Poets and and twice as much, and all these people that he managed. And because they were friends, Vicky'd say, yeah, bring them on, we'll have them on, on Friday. Somebody's dropped out, and it's the same thing with Kit Lambert. Can we have the Who have got a new single out? Can we have them in on Friday? They're not playing a gig that day. Yeah, sure. It was so freewheeling like that, And also, if you look at the episode guide that's at the back of the book, you'll see that, for example, bands like The Creation were on there, and they were an unknown quantity. The Artwoods, all these sort of people, and even like the American, like a lot of the great American soul acts, people like Sugar Pie DeSanto were on there. I mean, I don't know if she'd even appeared on television in America. She probably had, but for a mainstream show and to put her on in England, it was quite, maybe not revolutionary, but it's quite a forward step.
So when you say Vicky, you mean Vicky Wickham, and
Vicky
Michael
Wickham.
is Michael Lindsay Hogg, correct?
Correct, yes. Yeah.
So I just want to take a step back to the beginning of the show again. Now, was it successful immediately? Because, taking a chance and giving a show to a bunch of kids, that would never happen on the BBC, obviously. So
No.
how much rope did they give him to get it going? And when was it successful?
Well, the early shows, as I sort of mentioned, was still quite a sort of a mixed bag of, it wasn't just all pop music. It was a bit of a mixed media thing. Once the pop element took over, and once it was obvious that it was, squarely aimed at young people, then that's when the ratings went up. And when they started to get the big acts on, like they got the Beatles on, in fact, they got the Beatles on a week before they did their show at the Palladium, which was sort of now recognized as the start of Beatlemania. That's when all the other the networks in Britain said, we want the show. Because when it first started, it was only a London show. It was only going out in the London area. But then suddenly, they were getting letters from kids in Scotland saying, like, we've heard about this great show. And so eventually all the networks on commercial TV in Britain took the show up. And that's when the ratings really went through the roof. I mean, I think by the middle of 64, the show had been going for a year by then. They were getting like 14 million viewers, which when you think Britain only had, 30 million, 40 million people, it was quite a big chunk of viewers for a pop show at that time,
For sure.
And so then Elkin Allen was a genius at that point.
He, in his own mind, yeah.
Were those shows viewable on the continent?
They weren't. That was the weird thing, is that I think it had a lot to do with the unions, the musicians' union, and the whole thing about, the show, because they were miming in the first couple of years. They were just miming to the records, and I think there was some sort of musicians' union thing that the performances and the songs were only cleared for, being shown within the British Isles. It was never shown out of the UK. I think one show was shown in Australia, the one that had the Beatles in it, just because the Beatles happened to be touring Australia at that time. They bought the show. But no, it was never shown. And Elkin Allen actually went to America in 64 and I think 65 and tried to interest, network, ABC, NBC, CBS, and would you be interested in a version of the show? Probably recut, because a lot of the fashions probably wouldn't have made sense. A lot of the reference, maybe the sort of references were a bit too parochial. But of course, you guys had Shindig, and you had Hullabaloo, and you had,
Chivalry and
Upbeat,
Upbeat,
and all these regional shows. So it was sort of like, they couldn't really, Ed Sullivan, of course, and they couldn't really see why do we need a imported show when we've got our own?
Right. Can you just rattle off a short list, long list, whatever, of some of the groups that appeared on there? We know the big names, you can name them, but who else?
Oh gosh, I mean, just for the benefit of your listeners who haven't seen the book yet, there is an episode guide and an artist index in the book, but just some of the examples that are probably lesser known. I mean, you've got the Artwoods, you've got you've got the Poets, you've got
Creation, like you said, and
Creation, you've got Mark Bolan when he was unknown with his first single. You've got David Bowie when he was unknown with his first single. David Jones, as he was then. You've got just so many. Now I come to think of them, I actually have problems thinking of them, but there were so many of them went on there. The Sorrows, you know, just bands that were sort of almost like, I almost get the feeling, I actually asked Vicky, I said, had you seen these guys, or had you heard the records? What was it that made you put them on? And she said, some cases I did, but 9 times out of 10 we were desperate because somebody had dropped out, or an American act couldn't get a work permit and they couldn't appear, so we had to fill that space. So the next phone call that came through, it could be Tony Stratton Smith saying, Vicky, you know, I don't expect you to, but we've got a band called The Creation. We'll have them. We'll put them on.
Wow.
And so
I guess that
it was just a happy accident that a lot of these people went on to be, you know, renowned.
Legendary.
Graham Bond's another example, you know, just all these great acts.
Fantastic. Was there a sponsor system there? Did record labels pay to have their acts on?
No, that's the funny thing. Radio Luxembourg, which was, I'm sure you've heard about, which was like, you know, where a lot of people heard. That was a good example of sponsorship where Decca or EMI or Pi, the record labels would pay to have a show on Radio Luxembourg, so they played nothing but Decca records or Decca artists and things like that. With Ready Steady Go it was literally whoever had a record out. It could be on any label. And in some cases, as we know with Donovan, he didn't even have a record deal. He didn't even have a record out. That was Alkan Allen again, wanting to experiment. You know, somebody had come to him and said, listen, I've just seen this guy in Denmark Street, which is where they cut all the demo records, like your Tin Pan Alley. You know, and he's this sort of British Dylan. He's got a little like denim cap and he does all these folk songs. And Alkan Allen said, well, bring him up. And he auditioned, just played some songs in Allen's office. He said, okay, I'm going to try an experiment. We're going to have him on 3 weeks in a row. No one's ever heard of him. He's not signed to any record label. And they did, and he was like he was a household name overnight. And 4 or 5 weeks later, his first single, Catch the Winds, out, and it's a big hit. So that was, again, the power of the show.
Was there any point where a decision could be made that a group made it because of Ready Steady Go, that there was such a focus on them in particular? I know that there was a huge impact in probably sales and just the reputation of the groups getting around because of their appearance on the show. This is one thing that I don't think a lot of people realize now, that these kind of local programs, you know, even though it became a national phenomenon in Britain, and the American shows, which were very local, like Upbeat in the Midwest and Ohio and so on, and wherever, it really had such an impact on sales and who became popular and so on, where some of the groups maybe never made it on. And if they had gotten on, it might have become much more popular.
True. Well, I mean, the Kinks are a good example because they were on with their first single, Long Tall Sally, which was a flop. But Larry Page, their manager, actually got them on there because he knew Vicky, and he actually managed a group that actually recorded a Kinks song, I've Got That Feeling, 3 schoolgirls from Coventry called the Orchids. And they'd been on Ready Steady Go. So Larry Page said to Vicky, I've got this new group. And she said, okay, well, we've got a slot, bring them on. And they mimed to Long Tall Sally. And there's the famous story, which is probably well known to Kinks fanatics. And Ray tells it in the little essay he wrote for the book about, you know, their managers, Grenville Collins and Robert Wace, said, Ray, it's your first TV appearance. You've got to get that gap in your teeth filled. And, you know, Ray was sort of thinking, oh, well, okay, well, you guys know about show business. He said, well, we haven't got time to do it. So for Ready Steady Go, Ray actually wore a cap on his teeth. And he, as he says in the thing, I look like Bugs Bunny. I had the biggest teeth in show business on Ready Steady Go. And then after Ready Steady Go, he actually went back to the dentist to actually have the operation to get the cap filled. And that's when he said that the first big decision I made in show business was, no, I'm not going to have my teeth filled, you know, like, and that was it. You know, he said, right, I'm going to do it my way from then on. But even though Long Tall Sally was a flop, and they never appeared on the show with You Still Want Me, the second single, but You Really Got Me. You could almost say, I'd almost say unequivocally that Ready Steady Go made You Really Got Me a number one, because Vicky had heard it and said, yeah, come on and do it, and they actually performed. I think the first time they did it, they mimed it, but then the second time they came back, they actually did it live. It was at number one, like within weeks, It was the first show to put it on. Same with the Animals, House of the Rising Sun, 4.5 minute song about a New Orleans whorehouse. We don't want to know about that. But Vicky said, it's a great record, come and do it. They played it live, went into the NME chart the next week. The second week it was at number one, so that was the power of the show.
Talk a little bit more about the whole culture around the show, the whole Weekend Starts Here thing. It was an event for the young people in London, for the musicians too. Even if you weren't on the show, people would come by and hang out in the green room, right? Get drunk,
That's right.
take drugs or whatever, and just be part of the scene.
Well, because of where it was situated, right in the heart of London, and it was almost like a sort of like the industry stopped working on a Friday, and everybody from Brian Epstein, Mickey Most, Don Arden, all these sort of people in the music business, but also people in the fashion industry. Yves Saint Laurent, there's a picture of him at the show there. Barbara Hulaniki, who had the Bieber boutique, and even artists like David Hockney and footballers like George Best. It was almost like this sort of like what I call salon culture, where they all met because Ready Steady Go became known as the place to congregate and watch the show, and even if they were there just to sort of do a business deal or just find out the latest gossip. I mean, I interviewed Kim Fowley, and he said, like, I was an American in London in '64, and I went up there because PJ Proby, I was there with PJ Proby, and we'd go up there to check out the American acts that were coming over, even people like Dionne Warwick, just to find out what American records had come out. It was like a place to catch up on things.
Wow.
And also, once the show went off the air, it was free. It was like where else could you get a free drink in London at 7 o'clock on a Friday night? So that was a big incentive for people to go there. And then everybody would just go off to have dinner, and then they go to the clubs like the Ad Lib and the Scotch of St. James and all those now legendary swinging London clubs, But it was almost sort of like, okay, Friday night, where do we meet? I know, we'll meet you in the green room at Ready Steady Go. It was almost like a convenient meeting place. But all these sort of ideas were hatched, like, oh, this guy's going to take over the management of that band, or this record's coming out and they're going to do a cover of it before this band. So it was all like this gossip sort of, little sort of hive of industry that was happening.
Was there mob scenes at the studio when certain groups appeared there? And how was it decided who was going to be able to come in and actually watch?
Well, yeah, there was mob scenes every week practically. In fact, there's a great photo in the book there when the Stones were on the first anniversary show in August of '64. And they had to leave from there to go and play the Richmond Jazz and Blues Festival. So there was a big crowd knowing that they had to leave. And they got into a chauffeur-driven Daimler, and the kids outside were so frenzied that they tore one of the doors off. There's a picture in the book of a policeman holding a car door that these kids had torn off, and you see the Stones driving away, less one door on the car, So, but every week, yeah, there would be kids outside the studio trying to get autographs, trying to mob the groups. And the way how the kids got on the show was. The production team of the show would actually go out to the clubs like the Flamingo, the Scene Club, the Marquee, and actually look for kids that, even if they weren't the best dancers in the world, if they had a look, if they looked different or they had something, then, they get tapped on the shoulder. What are you doing next Friday? Come and be on Ready Steady Go. And that constituted a lot of the audience. And the Ace Faces, as they were known, tended to be invited back every week. So you tended to see a lot of the same faces come back,
Thank you very much, Simon. It's going to be interesting to see how far that one goes. Where's Patrick? Patrick, what dance are you going to do for us this week?
Well, it hasn't got a name, but it's the one that they're all doing round on the London scene these days, you know.
Yes.
And it's a great dance, just in time for the Christmas party, so very quickly, it hasn't got a name. The record is Georgie Fame, yeah, one of his best.
Thanks very much, Patrick. Let's see
I'll
it. Make
say
it easier than last time.
I will.
Bye.
But then they'd also give out, you know, they'd have dancing competitions in the local ballrooms, and the winners would get tickets, you know, and they would go around the country and, you know, go to Brighton, for example, and see like kids and, you know, have competitions because it was so popular. You know, the waiting list to get on there, you know, they had enough people. I think I quote in the book, there was enough people on the waiting list for the next 6 years or something. You know, they're saying, please, no more applications. We just can't get everybody on.
And was there competition between the shows like Top of the Pops and Ready Steady Go with who could be on or whatever? I mean, there was none of that kind of jealousy between the shows. Like saying,
Not really.
You can't have the Kinks on this week because we're having them on this week.
No, not really. I mean, you know, they could be on Top of the Pops because Top of the Pops went out on a Thursday. Ready Steady Go went out on the Friday. So no, they could be on the same show the same week. I mean, ideally that's what they wanted, so they get maximum exposure, you know.
Right. No exclusivity.
Sometimes there was, but generally not. I mean, usually what tended to happen is they were usually like a week apart. Sometimes, you know, the record would come out on the Friday and they do Ready Steady Go that day, the day of the release, and then usually the record entered the chart that week, and so they'd be on Top of the Pops as, you know, a climber, as they called it, you know. And also Top of the Pops appealed to a much wider demographic. It was like family entertainment, really. You know, you did get the Kinks on there, you did get the Pretty Things on there, but you also got Val Doonican, the Seekers, you know, you got fairly middle of the road, safe entertainment. And that's really what, you know, that the ratings went up because of that. Whereas when Ready Steady Go would have somebody like Wilson Pickett on, or a whole show devoted to James Brown, the ratings went down. You know, it was too what's the word I'm looking for? It was probably too forward thinking, really, that people couldn't handle that.
Wow. So when did that whole lip syncing thing, the miming thing, stop, and live performances began on the program?
Well, that actually started to bring in live performances sort of subtly in '64. And again, this tied into Alkin Allen wanting to make the show as authentic as possible. And he hated miming. He hated just seeing, like, you know, somebody like Gene Pitney walk around a studio, as he said in his own words, miming words like a goldfish. You know, he wanted to see like people sing live, and if they fluffed a note or forgot the words, that was all part and parcel of it. You know, he didn't care. Again, it was this authenticity thing he was keen on. And so '64, he started to, you know, every week he started to bring in like a live element of the show, and he would generally get bands that he knew could cut it live, like Manfred Mann, Georgie Fame and the Blue Flames, the Animals, bands that were, you know, had cut their teeth in clubs, you know, in the word like club acts. And so they would come on each week, and so you would get, for example, Manfred Mann would do Our Diddy Diddy, but they'd mime that, but then they'd plug in and do Smokestack Lightning, or you know, one of the songs off that first album, they'd actually play it live. And then gradually that took over, and the feedback that was coming in was quite positive. Oh, we like this, you know, it's like going to see our favorite acts play live. And, you know, the main challenge is that they were in such a small studio. And of course, TV was still quite young, you know, in terms of trying to get neat rock and roll sounding live, you know, especially they couldn't tape it, you know, it was literally going out live. So if they got feedback or the mics died, you know, it was always that sort of tightrope walk trying to get it right. But then, again, the union were always up in arms about miming. They think, you know, musicians, you know, it's a livelihood, you know, bands should play live. You know, it's a cheat that people are just sort of miming to their records when they probably didn't even play on them, sing on them. You know, we want to see the artist actually play it. So when you get to 1965, that's when Alkin Allen took the decision to, right, okay, we're going to move out of this small studio. We're going to move up to a bigger studio, and everything's going to be live. You know, if Dusty Springfield did a record with a 40-piece orchestra, you're going to hear it with a 40-piece orchestra and backing singers. That's the way we're going to do it, and that's it. And that's what it did. And it was quite canny in a way, because it was quite a cunning reinvention to do that. And it was also a good way of, you know, getting the ratings going again, because the ratings, I wouldn't say they'd tanked, but they'd got a little bit stale. So that format change was a way of keeping it fresh. And also it kept the show in the headlines saying, you know, will the Dave Clark Five be able to play live on the show? You know, can Twinkle sing live? You know, also all that sort of thing. So a lot of people used to tune in to try and see the calamities, you know, try and see what would happen if these people, you know, did fall in a screaming heap and couldn't play live.
Speaking of our Kinks, there's a quote in the book. It says, when Ready Steady Go went live, everybody thought it was fab. I think it'll ruin most of the groups. I am crazy about the Kinks, but every time they appear on the show, they sound horrid.
Yeah. Well, that's the sort of thing you got. The funny thing is if that show still survived, we'd probably think it sounded fantastic. But you see, people were so concerned. I mean, the average television viewer, and I guess it hasn't changed that much, it's pretty conservative of what they want to see. And so if you were a pop fan and you'd heard, I don't know, See My Friends on the radio, and then you're hearing the band try and do a live approximation of that song, you know, when there's the drone and all that stuff, and the engineers on the show aren't used to recapturing live music, it probably did sound terrible to some ears. To us now, it would be endlessly fascinating. You know? That's the thing, you know, people didn't know what they had.
Well, I don't believe that the Kinks sounded crappy. I think that was a non-Kinks fan who was talking. Because listen, look at all the BBC stuff that was recorded on the Kinks. It sounds pretty good to me. I think they were probably fantastic, and somebody just was not wanting to say that they were so great. Some Who fans, you know how they are.
I just brought it up because I wanted to show the different reactions that people were getting from going from the miming, the lip syncing, to a live performance. I mean, some people maybe just didn't prefer it. That's all.
No, well, that's true though. I mean, it's a good point because, as I say, like, you know, records, I mean, singles were relatively affordable, but a lot of people, and I think this is why Top of the Pops basically, you know, overtook Ready Steady Go in popularity, is because Top of the Pops, if you watched it, they were just basically miming to the record. So if you were tuning in every week, that's what you'd be, you know, you were hearing the record that you'd be buying that was on, you know, that was on the disc. With Ready Steady Go, you were hearing a live version, and, you know, a lot of people sort of hummed and hawed about that because they thought, well, you know, if I'm going out to buy this record, it doesn't, you know, this isn't what I'm going to be, you know. And that was, unfortunately, it was a catch-22 because token, but by one token, it was a brave move, and you were actually hearing, you know, a band actually playing it live. But on the other token, you weren't getting the record that people wanted to hear. Unlike Top of the Pops, where you had to have a record going up the charts to get on the show, Ready Steady Go, you could just be somebody that's coming through, visiting artist, and they could also do, with the format, you could do duets, like they had Dionne Warwick and Paul Jones duetting, or, you know, there was another one with Oscar Brown Jr. and Paul Jones, and Tom Jones and Cilla Black and people like that. You know, they had all these things that you could do, songs that weren't, you know, you hadn't recorded, that were just in your stage act. That was another thing. You know, you got the Yardbirds doing Train Kept a Rollin' before it had even been recorded. You know, they hadn't been to Sun Studios to record it, but they were doing it in their act. So, you know, that's when you first heard it. In fact, the Kinks did Milk Cow Blues on Ready Steady Go before they'd even recorded it. You know, so.
Wow, that's great. So one thing about the show also that is so unique is that it almost was like a talent show. That's unheard of on any of the American programs that were here. You had to have a record in order to get on a show, you know, and there, to, like you said, they gave Donovan 3 shots at stardom, and he became a huge international star.
Yeah, that's it. Well, funnily enough, Eric Burdon, when he was in the States, when he, you know, and he's quoted in the book, he'd be on the Ed Sullivan Show, and they'd be in Studio 50 in in New York for like 3 days on end rehearsing. And as he said, you know, the Supremes would be in tears in the dressing room next door because Sullivan had yelled at them and because, you know, they'd missed their cue or something like that. And they'd be in like, you know, a hot New York summer, like in the studio for days on end. And he would say to the technicians, you know, you've got a lot to learn. There's a show in England, Ready, Steady, Go, where we just turn up. You know, we get there in the morning, we do a sound check, and then that's it. And if we break a string or we did, or whatever, it's all part of it. You know, it's like everything it's seen with American TV and even other American acts. Like, I've got a quote from the Byrds and the Beach Boys saying the same thing. You know, like, we were quite surprised how free and easy Ready, Steady, Go was compared to American TV. I mean, even Jack Good and Shindig, you know, that show was rehearsed 3 days and then taped. I don't think it was live, was it? It was always taped. So, you know, it was quite a different kettle of fish, as we say over here, to American rock and roll television.
On the flip side of that, though, I don't remember, was it Sandy Shaw, where they basically played her song and she didn't come out?
That's right.
Because she didn't know she had to come out, so they played the song without her. Is that right?
Yeah, they kept going over and over, as the girl backing singer said. The musical director was just keep going. And she was in her dressing room, and, you know, she was just completely unaware that her name had been called. And somebody had to literally go into the dressing room and drag, you know, she had to literally get ready and go on, you know. But that was the sort of thing that people tuned in to watch, to see these, like, you know, goofs. It was part of its charm. A slick choreographed show, you would see, you know, the day-to-day, you know, accidents that would happen.
And there were some that were on purpose, right? Didn't Eric Burden say that he hated miming, and so every time they had to mime, they would mess it up on purpose? Is that right?
Yeah. So that's why when it went live, you know, he was grateful that, you know, he could actually, you know, sing it how he wanted to, you know. But, you know, there's another one with Eric Burden. I just remember when the Small Faces were on the show for the first time, he called them the New Faces. You know, he didn't, you know, so things like that got in there, you know. And another great one was when Buddy Guy was on the show playing live, backed by John Mayall's Blues Breakers with Clapton on guitar. And Keith Fordyce, who'd obviously had a quick look at his notes, said, "And I think this young man is going to be the chubby checker of the future."
Wow.
And next on Ready, Steady, Go, one of our favourite guests. He just made an EP, one of the tracks you may have heard already. That was 24 Hours from Tulsa. Now we'd like you to hear another one called Every Day I Have to Cry. And it's Dusty Springfield.
They moved the show at some point to Wembley?
Yeah, a much bigger studio up there. It was run by the same TV network. It was their studio, but it was much more space, and so they could get more people in, and then they could get an orchestra if they needed it, and, you know, there was more space and facilities.
So that changed a lot, what we just talked about, the whole culture of meeting on Friday night there, and everybody going there. So would you say that maybe, even though they had a strong year or so after they moved, that maybe that was the beginning of the end of Ready, Steady, Go?
It was, although nobody knew it at the time, but it definitely killed that, the basement and, you know, the studio in the centre of London. It was this like almost like a little sort of clique, a little club. Once you moved up to the bigger studio, I mean, the acts and the groups and all the people, the sort of people I've mentioned, still went up there. But the vibe had changed and it wasn't quite the same. And, you know, as I said earlier, when Top of the Pops started to gain in popularity, things were taking a slide, but it was still a place where you went and hung out and you know, found out what was happening, but it wasn't quite as close-knit as the other studio.
Should we talk about the Kinks specifically a little bit?
How many times were they on?
They were on 17 times.
Woo!
So they were amongst the artists that were on a lot, you know. I think the act that was on there the most, would you believe, were the Searchers. I think the Searchers were on there something like 21 times. The Stones were on there 21 times. Dusty was the one that was on there the most. I think she was on there about 25 times. But the Kinks were on there 17 times, and the Who were on there 17 times. So there you go. They just parallel each other all the time.
Oh, that's nuts.
What do you think were their best performances that they actually performed live?
But as far as the Kinks go, there's a Milk Cow Blues. There's a great live Milk Cow Blues, which again is, the one that survives is the one from when the Controversy album came out, and they were promoting that, so they played it live then.
Legs everywhere, and everybody in the audience.
So
that survived.
The reason why that survives is because a lot of kids were taping the show with their little portable reel recorders and holding the microphone at the little television speaker. And so that's how that happened to survive.
Well, how was it tracked down? That's interesting, because when we talked to Andrew Sandoval about putting together one of the Kinks anthologies, there's a clip from an American show that there's no video for that we asked about, and it was the same thing. Somebody had recorded it on a little tape recorder.
That's how A Strange Effect came out too. A Strange Effect was taped off of the radio.
The BBC,
yeah. And a lot of these things circulated for years with.
That's right. Because also, it was a cheap way. If you couldn't afford to get the records, you could just take the soundtrack. And also, especially when the show went live, there's some fantastic performances that survive of, like, the Yardbirds playing live on there, and the Who playing live on there, and there's I'm trying to think of, there's some really fantastic performances. I'm trying to think what else is that they did. They do Hide and Seek, that song, which they did that on Ready Steady Go live, and there's a great version of Louie Louie they do with I think there's a sax player on, and I initially thought it was the guy from the Dave Clark Five. Is it Dennis Payton, who was the sax player in that band? But it's not. It's actually the house band with the Kinks, and they're playing Louie Louie live. And they were on live quite a bit, and because they were the headliners, they tended to play out the show. And it's quite funny, that Louie Louie performance. At the end of it, he says, "I gotta go now." I gotta go now, and I gotta go now. And they keep going and going, because they still haven't been told that when it was still on the air, you got to keep playing, because that was the problem. Ready Steady Go, the timing was always a problem, because some acts they'd try and time the show down to the last minute, and of course some acts would be overrun or some would be short, and so by the time you got to the final act, they had to keep going to fill that airtime.
Next week, the Who, the Four Tones.
Were there any incidents that you can talk about on the show, or that happened around the shows that might have been kind of tabloid, rather than just this well-mannered kind of a rock and rolly kind of a scene? Did it get really crazy?
Well, there was a certain amount. There was a certain amount of drink. I mean, as we talked about, it was a free bar there, so the drink was always there, and but there was a lot of pills around and a little bit of pot smoking. Davedavies says that he said, "I always loved it when we were on the show with the Who, because Keith Moon always had pills." So that was where he used to get his scores of pills. But there was generally the things that went on in dressing rooms and things that happened on the show. And in fact, talking about the Kinks, there was one show they were on in January of '66, and I asked Ray about this, and he said, "I've got no memory of that at all." That because the Kinks were always accident prone, as you know. They were either like having accidents, either with cymbals over drummers' heads or guitarists' heads. But Ray got knocked out by a camera baffle. Like, they were on the show doing rehearsals, and apparently Ray got knocked unconscious, and it was reported at the time in all the music papers. He said, "I don't remember at all." So whether he got permanent amnesia from that, I don't know. And there was some of the shows where, like, I think Mick was ill, and their roadie had to sit in on drums during the rehearsals and things like that. So, but there was always, the abiding memory Ray has of Ready Steady Go is when they did the Christmas show. They did a pantomime of Cinderella, and Pete Townsend and Ray were the Ugly Sisters.
Oh, man.
And they also sung My Two Front Teeth, right?
That's right. All I Want for Christmas is My Two Front Teeth. They actually went in and cut that track live, and I think the vocals were live. Yeah.
Yeah, what's the story? Disaster at RSG. It involves the Who.
That's right.
Of course.
Well, that was a special devoted to the Who, although it was only the last 15 minutes of the program, where they took it over and they did the tracks that you get on that Ready Steady Who EP, Batman, Disguises, Booker T, Barbara Ann. But what the disaster was is that the director wanted them to do the big finale with the smashing all the gear and everything like that, and it in a television studio, and because it was premeditated, it actually looked quite artificial. And if you look at the letters that are underneath that big banner headline, it's all saying, I go and see the Who live, and like when they do that auto-destructive thing, it looks like they really mean it, but on Ready Steady Go it just looked like it was just a piece of fluff. It didn't really mean anything. So that's really what they were on about.
Now the return of the
But I do want to touch upon the Who, because I do have your book, and I've had it for 20 years now.
Anyway,
I don't know if you can see it. There he is. That's the guy. That's the guy I want to ask about right there.
That's the one. That was the book that inspired Ready Steady Go, basically.
Well, I'm a big Keith Moon fan, and of course, everybody's got stories about Keith Moon, and there's plenty for Ready Steady Go. Do you have any that you can share with us?
What, connected to Ready Steady Go? Or,
yeah.
Well, we could be here all night, but in terms of Ready Steady Go,
wasn't he banned from being on one time for something he said?
Yes, he said something to Kathy. I think his briefcase had been stolen and his pill stash was in it, and he said something on air. I think it was something like, "Whoever took me briefcase, bring it back, because all me Haleys are in there." Now Haley Mills, rhyming slang, all me pill, and he thought that would go over the head of most people, but the TV bosses knew exactly what he was talking about.
Oh, man. Cockney slang.
Yes, exactly. But he also, when they did that Ready Steady Who special, they called the band up on to do a camera rehearsal, and I think it's described in the book. One of the eyewitnesses who was there said that Townsend and Daltrey came out first, and then Entwistle led Keith out, sort of led him out on a chain type thing, and he had a sanitary towel over his eyes or something stupid like that.
No.
And the camera, the studio floor manager said, "Could Mr. Moon please remove that before he's allowed on the set?" Or something. It's always, he was always doing things like that.
The wild man.
So you had mentioned that there are some other Kinks stories, or any crazy Kinks stories you want to share with us?
Ready, Steady, Go. Ray quite mysteriously alludes in his essay, said there are other anecdotes connected with Ready, Steady, Go that I'll just draw a discreet veil over.
Yeah, in the interest of good taste, they'll leave it alone.
Yeah. So stuff obviously went on, but they were always a handful. Vicky said that, when Ray moved to New York, she'd go and have tea with him up on the Upper West Side, somewhere where Ray had an apartment. And it was always like, what am I going to do about my brother? Expecting Vicky to help him, tell him what she would advise to help straighten Dave out, So, because Vicky was almost like the school mom. She was very, very proper. She if you ever speak to her, she's got a very, almost like a genteel English accent. So I think Ray thought that would help put Dave in line, but I don't think that that was ever going to work. So.
Would you say that Vicky was really like the driving force behind the show, like from the from behind, like making it happen? If so,
Oh yeah,
then she,
without a doubt.
well,
I mean,
she really was that's something
yeah,
different that a woman was actually.
Oh yeah, well that's the thing. I mean, that's another angle to the book. Although I don't play it up, but Alkan was quite. He let the Mavericks, if he thought they had something to offer, and it didn't matter what their sexuality was or what gender they were, or creed or whatever. He let them go for it, and that was the thing, to have a woman in charge of the show and booking the acts and basically putting the program together and telling people that they could or couldn't get on the show. It was quite a forward, it was quite a revolutionary thing for him to allow her to do, to let her basically do that. She says in the book that, as you can imagine, people were just constantly ringing her up saying, I've got this act on, can you put them on? And if she didn't like the record or she didn't like the band, she'd say no. She said, I wasn't afraid to say no, and that was quite something. So yeah, I mean, it was Alkan who was. If it wasn't for Alkan, there wouldn't have been a show. But if it wasn't for Vicky, that you wouldn't have had so many of those great acts on there. And
having Kathy as the host,
yeah,
you've got women on both sides of the camera. Pretty
right.
Innovative and great, and a real good feeling
like,
for all the gals out there.
When you got, for example, Shindig, you had like Jimmy O'Neill, like a young LA DJ,
Yeah.
With Ed Sullivan, you had this old journalist, who'd been around since like the 40s or even earlier, And so to have this young sort of she was a little bit older than what she claimed to be, but that was why the show took off, because if you're watching it and you're the same age, you can identify with it. Even if you didn't think she was particularly hip or cool, she was young. That was the thing. Yeah.
Well, and that was reflected in the guests as well. You had, we mentioned Sandy Shaw and Lulu and Dusty Springfield and the Orchids, and you mentioned a couple of others. I mean, they were
opportunity
who was on the show, right?
Yeah, it was. It was run on sort of other shows like Thank You Lucky Stars, which we haven't mentioned. That was it wasn't like Top of the Pops. They did actually give some acts exposure, like the Birds, Ronnie Wood's Birds were on Thank You Lucky Stars. They were never on Ready Steady Go. So they had, but it was very much run on conventional lines. The sets were really boring, and it wasn't really switched on like Ready Steady Go was. That was the key thing. It didn't rest on its laurels. It was always trying to find what was happening and get on to the next thing. That was the key to its success.
Well, what survived of the show?
Now, this is the downer. Unfortunately, only a really small percentage. I mean, the show, there was 173 episodes.
Wow.
Plus there was 3 New Year's Eve specials, and there was also a couple of specials where they went to Switzerland, they went to Montreux and that. So I think there's about 178 shows in all. Only 9 survived.
Sheesh.
Because
complete, you mean?
Yeah, 9 complete shows and some insert clips, some scattered clips. And the only reason they survive is because when Michael Lindsay Hogg was sort of thinking beyond the show, what am I going to go on to do? And he was aware that the engineers were given orders to wipe the show each week to reuse the tape, which was happening in America and other places as well, but nowhere near as much as here, because tape was expensive and bulky and everything. And he couldn't bear to see these things going. So when he did a show, like for example, the Stones doing the Mime tour, I Got Sonny and Cher's I Got You, Babe, and doing that great live version of Satisfaction, he knew that was going to get wiped, so he paid out of his own wage salary that he was getting to actually have that tele-recorded, or Kenny'd as you call it in America, because he knew it was going to get wiped. And so that's why certain clips survive, because Michael wanted a CV to show other directors, this is what I've done, type of thing.
I think when we're ready, which I hope very soon, we're going to do one. It's called Satisfaction. Here you go, baby.
And the only reason some of the other shows survive is because I think Alkin Allen wanted to try and enter them into a TV festival, you know, to compete in those. And also he thought they were ones like with the Beatles or the Stones that he could maybe sell overseas. But generally, you know, once they were shown in all the different networks, the 2-inch videotape would come back and, oh, we've got a current affairs show next week or a gardening program. Through the wiper, it's gone. Yeah.
On the other hand, though, a lot of photographs, obviously, from the book exist. Where did they come from?
Well, because, again, going back to what we're talking about the show being right in the middle of London, and because they were having all these famous pop stars on every week, Fleet Street or the newspapers and the media would send their photographer down to the rehearsals on a Friday, because all the shots, like the Kinks one, I can see there, that was taken during the rehearsals. So they couldn't shoot during the live show. I think that's the case with most TV shows. You can't take pictures during the taping. But so they would come down every week, and they were guaranteed to get good shots because there was all these different acts on every week. And similarly, the music press, you know, the NME and the Melody Maker or whatever would send their guys down to get interviews because they would all be there. You know, if you didn't get Dusty Springfield, you get Sandy Shaw. If you didn't get the Kinks, you get the Pretty Things because they were all on the show, you know. So, as Keith Altham, who was the journalist, said, I could get about 5 or 6 interviews in one day and then take the rest of the week off.
And I want to touch on the couple of specials that they had, the Motown Tamla and the James Brown.
The Tamla one was actually not a Ready Steady Go special as such. It was the same production team,
right?
And it was made by the same TV network, and it was shot in the same studio. But the Tamla one came about because they'd been trying to bring over a tour for some time, and Tamla at that stage was pretty much an unknown quantity in Britain. I mean, a lot of the bands covered Tamla songs like Money and You Really Got a Hold on Me and things like that. But generally, you know, apart from the Supremes and Mary Wells, the records hadn't really been hits here. So to bring a tour over was a bit of a gamble because not many people, you know, it's crazy to think about it now, but when you look at that Tamla tour that did come over, okay, you had the Supremes who were heard, you know, that were known, and the Miracles, but nobody had really heard of the Temptations, nobody had heard of Little Stevie Wonder, nobody had heard of like the Four Tops. It was quite.
Brenda Holloway became such a big star through that Motortown Review.
Yes,
and,
yeah, but
you know,
and if you're talking about just people buying the records every week who were buying what was in the top 20, you know, these acts were cult. They were cult really, and nobody knew about them. But Dusty had been on tour. She'd done a season at the Brooklyn Fox in New York, and she'd played on the bill with Martha and the Vandellas, and I think that Marvin Gaye certainly, and the Supremes. And so she would come back to London armed with all these records and play them to Vicky, and of course they loved them. And when they got wind of the fact that somebody was prepared to gamble and bring the tour over to Britain, Dusty said to Vicky, could you get these people on could you get them on Ready Steady Go? And she said, well, why don't we go one better than that? Why don't we get a whole hour-long TV special, you know, on the whole review, you know, get the show on TV. So, and this is a tribute to Alkin Allen. We've talked about his sort of free spirit and his sort of, you know, left way of doing things. When, you know, she thought she was going to have a hard sell, saying to Alkin, you know, can we put this on network television at a prime time slot? And Alkin just said, yeah, fine, but you've got to get Dusty to host it. And she said, well, I'm sure that won't be a problem. And that's what happened. And so they got in touch with Berry Gordy, and Berry Gordy, of course, was over the moon because he was just setting up the Tamla imprint in Britain. You know, all the records on Motown in Britain to that time had come out on these little subsidiary labels, Fontana and Oriole and all these sort of little labels. So finally EMI were going to bring the Tamla label out. So this all coincided at the same time. So for Berry Gordy, it was perfect. So when they actually booked the tour, and the sad thing is that the special was shown after the tour, not before. So, you know, the first date on the tour, I think, was in London at the Rainbow, what was called the Finsbury Park Astoria then. And it got good reviews, and the two shows were pretty full. But then they'd go to places like Manchester or Birmingham and all that, and they'd be empty houses. And you think, you know, you've got a show with Supremes, Martha and the Vandellas, Temptations, Stevie Wonder, Four Tops, and the place is half full, you know. So it was a disaster as far as, you know, getting people into the show. But that Ready Steady Go, that Sound of Motown special was very instrumental in, you know, Tamla being accepted in Britain.
The Dusty and Martha Reeves duet survives, right? Video?
It does, yeah, that was part of that special, yeah. And that was a special moment, you know, because that one, they're singing live, even though the backing, I think, is to the, you know, the original record.
Worst sounds I've ever heard on record. There came Heat Wave and Quicksand and, of course, Dancing in the Street. And here with their very newest success, Nowhere to Run, it has to be Martha and the Vandellas!
Once that show went out, then you started, whenever Martha and the Vandellas came over, or the Marvelettes, or Brenda Holloway, and they would be on the show, you know. I think that some of them had been on the show before that, but that was the first time that all of them had been presented like that on television in Britain.
So the soul influence and the American music, like being brought into Britain, was something that was, again, very much emphasized by Ready Steady Go.
Yes, definitely.
In being able to see this kind of camaraderie between the groups and so on, and delivering the whole mood that this is music that actually went along with all of the homegrown groups that were happening in Britain.
True, and also Ready Steady Go, as we sort of touched upon, was a big mod show. Like the mods loved all that stuff that, you know, they loved American imports, and they would get all these like rare Tamla singles in and Sue singles and things like that. And this is the sort of music that Vicky would play on the show. You know, during links, you'd hear stuff in the background, you know, Jimmy McGriff records and things like that. So, you know, for a Motown special, it was sort of catering to their fan base. But Vicky had a real sort of almost like a missionary type zeal to make the show get wider acceptance as well. So on one hand, it was catering to the mods and catering to the cult base, the fan base, but it was also trying to get this music exposed. You know, it was a double purpose there.
So the other one was James Brown, which was not received as well.
No, James Brown was sort of a leap into the unknown. Again, he was not very well known in Britain, but he was a big cult name. And again, he was coming over to England to do a couple of shows and to play in Paris at the Paris Olympia. And you know, as Vicky says in the book, it dawned on us, Michael, Lindsay Hogg and I, that we couldn't just have James Brown come on and do one song, because the whole James Brown's whole thing was the stage show. And they'd seen the Tammy show, you know, where he's just basically like steals the show. And you know, they thought, well, we're going to have to build a whole show around him. And so they'd actually watched the Tammy show and saw the big ramp. And so they did the same thing. They put a big ramp, and they basically did their homework and saw, okay, right, you know, this is where the famous Flames are going to, and this is where his band are going to be. And there's a quote in the book where Michael says the night before they taped the show, James Brown had been on Top of the Pops, plugging, I think it was, you know, I Got You, which was quite an old single, but it was his latest single in Britain. And they put him on a little round podium, and he had nowhere to dance, you know, he had nowhere to move with the kids, you know, it was just the wrong thing that you could possibly do. And of course he was miming to it. So James Brown, when he got to Ready Steady Go the next day, was expecting more of the same treatment, you know, stand over there and don't move. And when he got there, he saw the set, and he was right behind it, you know, because of course everyone had to call him Mr. Brown, and you know, but he knew that you know, there were kindred spirits there. They weren't going to sort of like condescend to him or make him do what he didn't want to do, and so you basically got a half-hour condensed version of what you would see at the Apollo, but it was unfortunately Britain in 1966 was, you know, quite a quite slow to move with the times, and again, people didn't know who he was, and the fact that a whole show had been devoted to this artist that nobody had really known didn't go down well. And some of the letters that came in were in this PC age. I'm not even going to repeat what some of them said, but it was, let's say, they were unenlightened, a lot of the letters. It was, and also that their kids will. This is, you've got to remember too that this is what the thing that made Ready Steady Go killed it. The fact that it was almost getting too hip and getting too sort of in crowdy, that it was actually alienating a lot of the kids that were watching it, who wanted to see the Yardbirds, who wanted to see, Crispy and St. Peter's or whatever. To see James Brown, who was sort of like, okay, if you went to the Marquee or the Flamingo or some of the hip mod clubs, yeah, you'd hear these records. But, you wouldn't necessarily get half an hour of this guy's stage show. It was quite, I think it was a bridge too far really for Ready Steady Go. And I think it, once again, it sort of killed a lot of the ratings, because it was almost going over the heads of a lot of the audience. I mean, you're right, a lot of the kids did like it, and a lot of people that went on to write about Black American music and Black music in general always cite that show as an example of, like, it was so far ahead of its time, and this is where I saw James Brown for the first time. But in some ways, they were in the minority. A lot of people didn't get it,
To the credit of the show, that they took these kind of risks and actually had legendary performances on that really cut through all the cultural stuff. That's right.
And, they just soldiered on and did what they wanted to do. And, even though the ratings and the critics and whatever, all of that be damned, they just did what they wanted to, really. And it's now that we look back on it and think, wow, look at that, a half-hour show to James Brown. But, it was sort of like, almost like commercial suicide in a way, but it didn't matter to them,
What year was the James Brown show aired?
66, March of 66.
And that was the last year of Ready
Yes,
Steady
it
Go.
was. Yeah.
And it was December of 66, correct?
Yeah, it was the last show, Ready Steady Goes, as it was aptly renamed for that show. It by then the writing was on the wall, Top of the Pops and all the polls. The music papers had, they polled the public, with favorite artist, favorite drummer, favorite TV show, pop TV show. And for the previous 3 years, Ready Steady Go, previous 2.5 years, Ready Steady Go had always come top. And then that was the first year that Top of the Pops came first and Ready Steady Go finished second. And I think also the network bosses were tired of it. They never really understood it. They liked the fact that it was pulling in the ratings at that time, but they were sort of like not quite sure about, do we really need this? And, I think it's time that it came off. And in some ways, if it had carried on, maybe it would have outworn its welcome, and maybe it would have got a little predictable and a little bit too. But yeah, and I think everyone connected with the show was looking to what would happen next. Vicky was looking to come to America, and of course she got involved with Patti LaBelle. She managed LaBelle, and who had been on the show, Patti LaBelle and the Bluebells. Michael, of course, went into directing. He did a show over, and he did a lot of the promotional films for the Stones and the Beatles and things. And then of course he went on to do drama. He did Brideshead Revisited, a big costume drama here. So everyone was looking to move on. I think it had sort of run its course in a way, and it was still exciting, but in a way maybe when it ended was the right time.
Well, also because 66 to 67 was a big change in the music as well, right? So definitely. Do you think that would have translated in the show? In other words, the psychedelic stuff, it probably wouldn't have matched the way the show was going, right? So it kind of seemed like the right time to go, almost.
It's a good point, because the other thing was is that Kathy was very much like this awkward teenager, and she was very much tied into that Carnaby Street mod thing, which, as you say, by 66 was giving way to psychedelia. And also 66 and 67, the scene was moving from Britain back to America. all the stuff on the West Coast was starting to happen, and you know, I think really that I think they could have adapted the show, and maybe Kathy, if they got a new host in, but then it wouldn't have been the same show. I think, you know, that maybe the production team, maybe Vicky could have started a new show, because, you know, Jimi Hendrix was on the second to last show, Cream had been on it, you know, all those names, and even like an unknown Pink Floyd, you know, before they'd even had a record out, had auditioned for the show. So those things were sort of, you know, knocking on the door. But I think really, if they would have carried on, I think it would have been the best thing to have done, would have been to have ended the show and maybe started something else. But I don't think it would have been the same. I think, you know, it just uncannily bookended that era. You know, it started with the Beatles and it ended with, you know, what was around the corner, you know, with the psychedelia and, you know, Flower Power and all that stuff.
Or they could have just had the Kinks on every week, because, you know, they didn't really get into that too much.
No, they didn't. In fact, the Kinks were meant to be on that last show. But as Mickavory said, you know, they expected us to just hang around and mime to a minute and a half of Sunny Afternoon. So we thought, nah, we're not doing that.
Fantastic. Just trying to, I'm over here on this end, trying to lift this book up. And I was wondering, would you consider maybe getting some wheels for it? So
don't get a hernia.
Yeah, really great. Well, what are you following this up with there, Andy?
That's a good question, and one I'd love to answer, but it's sort of, I've got a few irons in the fire, but I don't really want to say too much about them, not because I'm trying to be secretive or anything, but I just find that you curse things sometimes, you know, if they don't come off, you know. But yeah, there's a few things. There's a book I'm working on with a friend of mine in Australia on the Beatles tour. There's been a book on the Beatles tour there, which came out about 30 odd years ago. And it was good, but there's so much more information about that tour, because it's the tour, as you know, with Jimmy Nicol stood in for Ringo, and it's the biggest crowds ever to see them. But there's a lot more that is undocumented about that tour that's quite interesting. And you may think, oh God, another book on the Beatles, but it's one I've sort of been wanting to do for a while. So that's one project that's definitely happening. And a few other things, but we'll just have to see what happens.
Anything more to go along with this fantastic book, Ready, Steady, Go? The weekend starts here.
What more to go with that?
Yeah.
I think that's the final word on that.
Well, it's the final word on it. But I'm wondering, has there been something that I've missed? Has there been a documentary based around the book?
There was a documentary on the show that I was sort of involved in on a peripheral sort of level. I didn't really have that much to do with it. That the BBC made, which is ironic considering it was the rival TV station ITV that made it, but the BBC did a documentary, it's actually on YouTube. You can see it. I think it's called The Story of Ready, Steady, Go, and it went out last year just before the book came out. It's about an hour long, and it's pretty good. They interview Vicky and Michael. They didn't get to Kathy because, as I think is explained in the book, Kathy doesn't give any media interviews at all. She's sort of like the Greta Garbo of the thing. She doesn't talk about those days at all.
Did she go into media work after the show, or?
She did briefly. She sort of became a housewife, and then when her daughter was sort of an age, she sort of came back into television work again, but not for very long. I think for about a few years, and then she just sort of decided she didn't want to be in the public eye anymore, and she isn't. You know, you occasionally see photos of her turning up on the red carpet, but she pretty much doesn't want to know about those days.
Tell our listeners about some of your kink credentials.
Well, I got brought in by BMG, the record company who handled the Kinks back catalogue. First thing I worked on was the Sunny Afternoon. When the musical came out, there was a soundtrack album, and I think there was a compilation of Kinks songs that were in the musical, you know, the actual original masters for that, and I did the notes for that, and I interviewed Ray for it, and that worked well. And then they were doing the mono box set of all the mono albums, which Andrew put together, and I interviewed Ray, Dave, and Mick for that. And so it seemed to go well. And then I think the next project was it was coming up to the anniversary of Village Green, so this would be 2018, and they wanted to do this big sort of super duper deluxe edition, as they do of all these albums. So I said, okay, let's go and try and track down as much stuff. So Andrew was obviously looking for all the as much unreleased stuff as possible, and I again interviewed Ray, Dave and Mick for it. And it's just a shame because I'd interviewed Pete. I'd interviewed Pete for the Ready Steady Go book, but I thought he doesn't really want to talk about the Kinks stuff, and the Kinks are only a part of Ready Steady Go. So I wish now, if I knew now what I know, if I knew now what I knew then, and I can never say that right, I would have gone back and asked him a lot more things, that I could have used for that Village Green Preservation Society project. But we weren't to know. So that went well, and then Arthur, of course, was the next one, and I interviewed all of them, including John Dalton, and also we tracked down a guy called Jeffrey Cannon, I think, who did the notes on the album, and the guy who did the artwork, with the kangaroo in the pouch. I've forgotten his name. Apologies for that. And then Lola, the latest one. I interviewed all the members and wrote the story of the album, and so I sort of helped put together that side of the thing. Andrew does all the music side of it, and of course Ray gets involved as well and does things that how he wants to get involved, and it seems to work all right.
Thank you for all of your hard work and kinkdom.
Hey,
well, you're a kinkdom.
Hopefully there's
king.
a lot more to come.
Oh yeah, I think there's a lot more to be told. I think that you have to be putting that pedal to the metal over there on your side of the pond.
Yeah,
it's really great, and thank you so much. It's been a pleasure having you on.
Hey, it's been fun. Thank you, Johnny, and thank you, Miriam. It's great to be interrogated by like-minded people.
Right, and we are encouraging everybody out there, on both sides of the pond and world over. All you Waterloo Undergrounders, make sure that you go out and get this heavy tome. Yes, it's Andy Neill's great Ready, Steady, Go. The weekend starts here. And Andrew, next time that we're out there.
Only my mother calls me Andrew.
Okay. Okay, so I think what we'll have to do is we're just going to take the jacket along when we come over to your side of the pond and have you autograph that, okay? I hope you don't mind. Otherwise, we're going to have to be paying extra.
I think that's the lighter option. You won't get hit with excess luggage.
Definitely.
Well, I just wanted to, if I had to pick a Kinks song, I'd like a song off the Muswell Hillbillies album played called Complicated Life. And Complicated Life was the name of the biography written by the late, great Johnny Rogan, who we just lost in the last week or so, who was, as you know, the Ray biographer, and a huge Kinks fan, and did a lot to sort of uncover a lot of things that we now take for granted as Kinks knowledge. And it was totally unexpected, and he was a good friend of mine and a good friend of Doug Hinman's, a fellow guest of yours, and a huge important person in the Kinks chronology. So yeah, if we could play Complicated Life as a tribute to Johnny, that would be fantastic.
Thank you so much, Andy, and good luck to you over there, and we hope to see you on one side of the pond or the other.
Thank you, Johnny. Thank you, Miriam. It's been a pleasure being on the show.
Thanks so much, Andy Neill, for being our guest here on Waterloo Underground. It's been great talking to you about the great book that you have put together, years of heartfelt work and inspiration from you on Ready, Steady, Go. The weekend starts here. Hey people, you can pick it up at Amazon.com now and do so because it continues to sell out. Every time we go on, it's up, and the next minute we go on, it's sold out. So pick on up, okay?